Welcome to Whiskey Lore, The Interviews. I'm your host, Drew Hanish, the Amazon bestselling author of Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Irish Whiskey and Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon. And today, it is my pleasure to have a fellow whiskey traveler and author joining me here online. He is the author of Canadian Whisky, the New Portable Expert, and also the Definitive Guide. Well, there he's got, if you're watching online, he just held up a copy of it. I've got one back here too. And also his second book, which is The Definitive Guide to Canadian Whisky Distilleries. And so welcome to the show, Davin de Kerrgommeaux. Is that right?
Well, I say de Kerrgommeaux, but you got
it pretty close. There.
You got it pretty close. Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Drew. I appreciate that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, that's, I always try to do a little pre-research, and you have a long name that can be a little intimidating. And I was watching somebody online, and they said it the other way, and so it's stapled in my brain now. But you had said de Kerrgommeaux, so I will put that down in my notes. And remember, sooner or later it'll become standard hat. I always tell people I'm very concerned about how I pronounce things because when you have a last name like Hanish that's spelled the way it is, you get all sorts of variations on it. So I'm sure you've heard many for yours. So let's dive in a little bit here and talk about Canadian whiskey, because this is last year we went through and we were talking to people in Ireland and Scotland, and then going to some places like Australia. And, I was getting further and further away from where I'm based, and I'm thinking I'd really love to get somebody online to talk about Canadian whiskey, because I think for a lot of people, the Canadian whiskey, there is kind of a generalized view of what Canadian whiskey is. And what I have learned from learning about Irish whiskey is that when I walked into Irish whiskey, I had that same feeling, that it was a very sort of, they're blends, they're all blends. There's, really not much else going on in Ireland. Then I go and I find out, wow, okay, there's a lot of diversity going on in terms of distilling, and that I really didn't know what the rules and the concept of Irish whiskey is. And so for somebody who grew up in Detroit, and, my parents always had a bottle of Canadian Mist around, or Seagram's 7 and 7, or you name it. And then my brother actually lives in Texas, and he said that's what he grew up on, was drinking Canadian blended whiskey as well. And I'm going, well, here's the one kind of whiskey I don't know a whole lot about. So maybe it's time to dig in and learn a little bit more. So, and we have a lot of Canadian whiskey drinkers here in the United States. It is still one of the bigger selling whiskey lines in the country. So definitely worth knowing about.
Yeah, it's, I think, still, I think maybe it's tied with bourbon, but it's, in North America, Canadian whiskey sells more than bourbon, Scotch, and Irish whiskey combined, if you look at all of North America. It's pretty big, but it kind of flies under the radar. Canadians are like that too, so, but there's a lot of really, really interesting Canadian whiskey, and a lot of people also use it for highballs.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me is that when I first started getting into whiskey, Canadian was the first one that when we were doing whiskey tastings, as my friends would get together, I would always try to find a Canadian whiskey to sneak in there, because there are opinions about different styles of whiskey, and Scotch fans are, Scotch, you're just not going to do better than Scotch. And then, your bourbon fans, they're like, oh, bourbon is it. And I say, okay, you know what? Why don't we jump in and try something a little different? So the first Canadian whiskey I bought and brought to a tasting was Caribou Crossing, which I kind of call that the Blantons of Canada, because it comes in a decorative bottle that you collect your maple leaves on the top of the bottle and all of that sort of stuff. And everybody was impressed, and that really got me interested in trying to find other Canadian whiskeys. But I think the thing that confuses me and confuses a lot of people is that some of the rules for Canadian whiskey feel very liberal, and I think it causes some people to think, oh, is this really good quality stuff or not? So, and you'll hear people call Canadian whiskey rye whiskey, and you going, okay, does that mean it is a rye whiskey, or it's not a rye whiskey? So what are some of the rules around Canadian whiskey to have that label?
Yeah. Well, I think that if I can take a couple steps backwards, this is quite a misunderstanding, because American whiskey makers have a lot more liberty than Canadian whiskey makers do. To be called an American whiskey, there are only 4 requirements. I may not remember them right away, but they're on the TTB if you want to check there. It has to be made from a mash of grain. But of course, they don't define grain in the States as just the seeds. In Canada, it's just the seeds. But so there are some whiskey makers in the States who are making whiskey out of sorghum juice that they press out of the stems. Okay, so it has to be made from grain, a mash of grain. Okay, it has to be distilled to not more. This is American whiskey, distilled to not more than 95%. Well, that's very easy to achieve, because it is impossible to distill beyond 94%, because at that point the water and alcohol are evaporating at the same rate, so you never get above. When they want to go above that for to make alcohols for chemicals, they have to add benzene or something else so they can get up to 99%, and even then alcohol is hygroscopic. It pulls water right out of the air, so it doesn't stay. So that's okay. It has to have the flavor and taste of whiskey. Gee, that's pretty wild. That we have the same thing here, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the 4th one. Canada has all of those, but we have another one on top of that, which is, in Canada, the whiskey must be aged for a minimum of 3 years. Now, in America, it doesn't have to be aged at all to be called whiskey. If it touches wood, you can call it whiskey.
Right.
In America, they can use any kind of grain they want, any kind of they don't have to use a mash bill, but they can if they want, but they don't have to. And those 36 different kinds of whiskey that are listed on the TTB website, those really are just how you can name something that qualifies as being whiskey. If it's made with 51% Kergommeaux and matured for 2 years in new wood and things like that, then you can call it straight bourbon. You don't have to, but you can. So this is a big misconception from the start, because Canadian whiskey has everything that American has, plus one more regulation, which is it must be aged at least 3 years. So it's a bit of a misconception. Now, the thing that kind of gets people going wild is our 9.09% regulation, which says that Canadian whiskey makers may add up to 9.09%, that is 1/11th, 10 parts whiskey, 1 part of either mature spirits, not anything, mature spirits or wine. Okay, now, and so people get a little bit upset about that. Most whiskey makers don't do that. Many they'll make a whiskey for the United States that has 9.09% of something else, of American spirits added, and they'll make the very same whiskey, and it tastes exactly the same because they blend it to taste the same. For the rest of the world, which is just 100% whiskey, a good example is Black Velvet, But in any case, what people don't know, and no one ever talks about it, is that the American whiskey makers, for 28 of those 36 kinds of whiskey, they also are permitted to add flavoring. And their definition of flavoring is not spirits at least 2 years old or wine. Their definition is anything that is not harmful. So that stuff you buy in a bottle, this is American regulations on the TTB website. Little bottle of stuff you can buy online, and you dump it into a bottle of vodka and you have instant whiskey? They're allowed to add stuff like that. I'm not saying they do. But they can add hugely potent chemicals that are produced in flavor labs. So what they do is they take the rules for straight bourbon and compare it to Canadian whiskey. And that just really is a non-starter, because there are more kinds of whiskey than just bourbon, and more kinds of whiskey than just straight bourbon made in the United States. I've got a nice graph that shows that bourbon is not the biggest part of the graph for the kinds of whiskey made in the United States. So it's
Okay.
really people just they compare one kind, straight bourbon, to Canadian whiskey, and of course, then it seems a lot more flexible in Canada. But overall, whiskey makers in the States have so much more latitude than they do in Canada. People who say otherwise they just haven't read the rules carefully.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
I think
read
that, as you
chapter
say,
4.
there.
Yep. So read chapter 4, but then read chapter 7, and you'll see of the TPD regulations.
Yeah. No, it is. It's really interesting because even in my own mind, I do sort of not even think about what the rules of just straight regular whiskey is in the United States, because the whiskeys that we have that are like that, like for instance, I think Early Times has a Kentucky whiskey. And so it came from Kentucky. It was put in used cooperage. It was only aged for 2 years or less, I believe. And so it's 40 ABV. But then the other day we got into a little online discussion about Fireball, and Fireball sells Fireball cinnamon whiskey, but it's 60 proof. And so you're going, wait a second, how can it be 60 proof and be whiskey and have flavoring added to it? So it's just a matter of really understanding the rules and being able to figure out what passes and what doesn't pass. And I think something else that's interesting is when I was in Ireland, learning that they could use different types of wood besides fresh new oak or used oak. They could use any type of wood. So is that also the same in Canada, or is there a restriction on the types of woods you can use?
No, we can use any type of wood, and so can American whiskey makers. They can use any type of wood they want. But here's the thing. I don't see you anymore, Drew, by the way. The only wood that really is useful for maturing whiskey is oak, because every other type of wood that I know of leaks. It's because oak has it has pores in it, but it has little plugs that they're called tyloses that prevent the whiskey from getting out, but they let the air get in and they let the vapors get out. So you get a renewal of the oxygen in the barrel, and that is what leads to aging. Long-aged whiskey often has notes, or maybe like sweet nail polish or something like that. That is oxidation of ethanol that causes that to happen. And that only happens in oak. Now, they say that this is hickory whiskey, or this is cherry whiskey, or whatever. They put inserts in the oak barrels to get that. They don't make cherry barrels.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've ever seen a cherry table, I mean, you can almost see the holes going right through an inch of cherry. But people put inserts in. Now this was pioneered by Maker's Mark, of course, with the Maker's Mark 46. They use French oak, but whatever. So yes, we can use any kind of wood, but so can you in America.
Okay. Yeah. But I think we have to have it age in an American oak barrel, but other oak or other types of wood can be put inside of that barrel. But the regulation is that some kind of oak, not American oak, but some kind of oak has to be used for the outside container that it sat in for moments.
But practically speaking, everybody has to use oak because it's the only wood that works.
Yeah.
So yes, we can use any kind of wood, but nobody uses anything other than oak because it would evaporate before it matured. So we use inserts like Black Swan Cooperage in the States has been selling different kinds of wood. They make honeycomb staves and things like that people put in their barrels. The little guys have been doing it in Canada for a long time, and they've been doing it the same in the States. So they put some hickory in, or some cherry, or some maple, or some birch. I've tasted all of these; they're quite nice. Now one of the big distillers has just released one that's made with hickory wood. But believe me, it's an oak barrel with an insert, the same as it is when the craft distillers in the States do it.
So do you find majority of Canadian whiskeys have a maple note to them? Because so many of them that I've tried do, but that may be the limited quantity of whiskey that we get down here.
I think that most of them have a butterscotch note or a caramel note that comes. It's oak caramels. Then when they're matured a certain way, they taste like butterscotch. A lot of the maple syrup that I've tasted in the United States doesn't taste like maple syrup to me. It tastes like something that is made in a lab or something like that to taste like maple syrup. Maple syrup that we get up here is kind of woody, and it's sweet, but it's not like sugary sweet. And I do get maple notes in some whiskeys, but I would say probably not more than 10%. But it is, yeah. You know, when you get that, you know, the chemical is sotalon that gives you that flavor, that maple flavor in real maple syrup, sotalon, S-O-T-O-L-O-N. And you do get that in Canadian maple whiskey. If you ever want to know what it tastes like, you can take fenugreek seeds and fry them in a dry skillet, and you'll get that same real maple flavor.
Really interesting.
Yeah, it's cool.
I was going to say you have a science mind. I take it you have a very deep interest in the technical side of things. It sounds like. Well,
you're asking me science questions.
But I couldn't flow them out. I couldn't flow those answers out the way you are.
I have studied whiskey steadily for more than a quarter of a decade, and I really have gathered a lot of information, and in fact, I've gathered enough information to know that there is a lot more that I don't know. So, things that I'm not confident about, I will just say I don't know. But yeah, I've put a lot of time into studying flavor, and I mean studying perfumes, and studying wine, and studying how people taste flavor. If you want a good book, read Nosedive. It really tells you a lot about flavors, and at the end it really gets into good things like why incense smells the way it does, and that. But there are lots of great books out there about flavor. They're boring, but they're useful. Other than Nosedive, Nosedive isn't boring.
Okay, I love the history of flavor. I love the fact that I grew up in school with the tongue map. And that I hear people talking about the tongue map, but as I went back and did research on the tongue map, come to find out it was based on research that was basically saying this guy was just seeing slight variations in flavor between spots on his tongue. He wasn't trying to say you taste only this in one section of your tongue and you taste only this in another section. It took somebody else trying to decipher his German to come to find out that with this weird he looked at a chart, and the chart was basically showing top to bottom the degree of power, but there was nothing on the side. There was no legend on the side to tell you the power difference, and he was just basically saying a little more here and a little more here, and the next guy picks it up and says, oh, so you only taste this here. And now I hear people on tasting at tasting events going, the tongue map, and here's where you taste your whiskey, and I'm going, okay. That's one of those things that definitely needs to be debunked, because when I taste a whiskey, I sometimes will taste certain flavors in some areas, and they'll stand out. Like people will say, oh, you get that rye flavor in the back of your palate. I get it on the sides. I get like the spicy notes really come out nicely on the sides of my tongue. So it's interesting to debunk those things and see that we all kind of taste differently.
Yeah, you get the pepper on the side of your tongue, that's for sure. That tongue map is pretty much out of date now, because those regions that taste a certain thing, if that thing isn't present in the whiskey, they'll taste something else. So
yeah. Well, and down to your tasting experience too. When I say maple, I don't live around that much maple, and as you say, whenever I go to buy maple syrup, I try to find maple syrup that's natural maple syrup, not the stuff that has basically corn syrup for 80% of what's in the bottle.
Yeah, well.
But you've grown up around it, so you're much more familiar with those flavors, the more natural flavors.
Yeah. To me, the most flavorful maple syrup is the stuff that is harvested at the end of the season. And You know, and you'll often see that one individual producer will put out 3 grades of maple syrup, and it's just based on when it's harvested, because, you know, it changes over the season. But
Natural product. It's going to evolve. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It really is. Yeah.
It's aging in wood, but a different way. Nobody put it there. It got there itself.
Yep, it fell from the sky.
Very nice, very nice. So let's talk about, first of all, a little bit about your background. How did you get into whiskey writing, and what were you doing before to transition into this?
Well, I was writing before whiskey. You know,
Okay.
I used to write. Started in high school. I had a column in the high school newspaper, and it lasted 2 issues, but nonetheless, I was there for the whole thing. And, you know, I had one of those community entertainment newspapers for a while here in Ottawa, and then I published another one called What's the Poop, that was kind of dealing with bands and things like that in London, Ontario, and I just went from one thing to another. I've always enjoyed writing. I started really getting into whiskey late in the 90s, and there was not much happening on the web at all. I managed to get in touch with a few people right around the world, actually. We started a website called the Malt Maniacs, which turned out to be hugely influential, probably because we were the only ones who were really doing a non-commercial website about whiskey. Back then, my dram of choice was single malt Scotch, and everything else was crap. And I really, really got into that. And I got fooled when someone poured me some excellent Japanese single malt. And I realized, you know what, Scotland's not the only place. And then Amrit came along, the Indian single malt, which is still just wonderful stuff. And so then, you know, I started branching out, tasting other things. I started drinking more Canadian whiskey. It's 1/5 the price of Scotch, and I found if you buy the bottom shelf stuff, it doesn't taste that great. But if you just at that time just spend $5 more, you can get some pretty decent whiskey. And now there are some just wonderful connoisseur drams out there. So I still like my Scotch. I remember at a whiskey show, I think it was in New York. Dan Tullio was there from Canadian Club, and I was over talking to him, and he reached under his table and he pulled out a bottle of Maker's Mark and poured it for me and said, "Tell me what you think of this." And you know, I have to say, he was pretty darn good. And I kind of had to be dragged into Canadian whiskey, and I kind of had to be dragged into bourbon. But I love my bourbon now. And Irish whiskey, yeah, I did a good tour of Ireland, and it's like you say, you know, like we have maybe 20 Irish whiskeys here, and they have like 600 over there. And you go into a bar, and it's from one end to the other Irish whiskey, and they're amazing drams, just wonderful drams, and not that expensive in a bar. So. So I pretty much like it all. I started writing about whiskey with the Malt Maniacs, and we published a e-zine at the time. And we went to Glengoyne once, and there we were in their brochure, our notes and our comments and things like that.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly we realized, holy crow, you know, people are reading this. And you know, every time we went to a distillery in Scotland, they treated us like we were, you know, some kind of celebrities. And we were just enjoying our whiskey, so it kind of grew from that. When I got into Canadian whiskey, though, I started a website, you know, CanadianWhiskey.org, and then Whiskey Magazine asked me if I would write for them about Canada and Canadian whiskey, and then Whiskey Advocate did the same, and it just kind of mushroomed from that. And I was, you know, visiting distilleries, and I was tasting all the whiskeys and making notes. It was my daughter. My daughter Danielle said, "You know, Dad, you're writing a book." And I thought, "Holy crow!" So 7 years later, I published the first edition of my Canadian whiskey book, and it's you know, it really has been I hate to use the cliche organic growth, but it really has kind of happened without a big plan to do so.
Yeah, it's interesting that we share that in common. That I got very interested. I started out actually liking Scotch whiskey first, and then kind of worked my way around. It was like there's got to be, there's more out there. I need to know kind of what the differences are, and it started out for me as a blog, and traveling through Kentucky and writing up, and it's like, you have all this information, why not teach people? What's interesting is, though, there are a lot of books on Kentucky bourbon, and I don't find very many books on Canadian whiskey, so you're kind of blue ocean out there with writing on that definitive of a guide on Canadian whiskey and really introducing people to it.
Yeah. Well, it's a big country, and it's very expensive to travel in Canada, and it's like hundreds of miles of barren territory. It's not like there's a whiskey trail like you have in Kentucky or in Scotland. If you're going to go to visit a distillery, plan on that being the only thing you do that day. And if I'm going to a distillery, I'll usually drive there the day before, stay in a hotel that night, do my whiskey visiting and writing up the next day, and then I'll stay in a hotel, and then I'll drive home. So it's like 2 nights in a hotel to visit one distillery. It's not like Kentucky where you can. Well, I think in Kentucky I maybe have done 4 distilleries in a day, and certainly in Scotland. Yeah. And it's really it's quite different. So I think it's quite daunting to people, and also. There's just so much misinformation out there about Canadian whiskey, and that I think people are just overwhelmed with how much there is to know. And as for those books, all those books about bourbon, I honestly don't believe someone should sit down and write a book unless they're going to tell you something new, or tell you something in a really different way, make it easier. It's just, I can remember in the early days with Scotch, there were a whole bunch of what we called cut and paste whiskey books, cut and paste Scotch books, and they were just one after another. That was just the same as what somebody else did. So all they did is put their name on it and put it in their own less erudite words. I remember one that copied Michael Jackson's Companion. Oh my goodness, so. I think that hurts the whiskey industry, because it means that it's more difficult for the writers who really study and really have something to say to be heard, because there's so much noise of Me Too, of people just writing for their own ego or something like that.
Yeah, it's really shocking to me too, how one book can get something very wrong, and then another book shows up and also gets it very wrong. Me always taking kind of a history focus, it's left a grand opportunity for me. I wouldn't have a Whiskey Lore Stories podcast if it weren't for the fact that there's so much information that's misinformation that people just take as everyday fact about bourbon and other types of whiskeys.
Yeah. Well, I was just talking to some people last week on a podcast like this about writing a book, and I was saying that the most important person in the process of writing a nonfiction book is your fact checker. Mm-hmm. Because you have to check your fact. If you don't get the same information from at least 2 different sources, then it's not. You can't be sure it's right, and your fact checker then has to go back and find all the facts and come back and say, why did you say this? Where did you get this information? Prove this to me. Show me this. I've had some really interesting discussions with fact checkers. Things that really seem to be disputed sometimes are dates of death, because people go back later and they change things so that people die at a more convenient time, like not when they're with their mistress, for example. Yeah.
Well, and believe me, when I'm doing my history research, and this is the challenge, you may be finding this as well, because I heard it through the grapevine that you are working on a book on Canadian Prohibition history. And boy, I tell you, the difference between writing a travel book and writing a history book, once it comes, one of my favorite writers is David McCullough. And if you look at one of his books, he does great storytelling for about 600 pages. And then there's about 200 pages of footnotes at the end where he has just dug in and found every single, corroborating fact that it's, it, and then I go look at some of the history books that I've read, and I go look in the back, and it's like bibliography, and it mentions about 5 other books that it used as its reference for this history. And it's like, no wonder, as I found with, even newspapers, I had that same thing. My dad was a writer of presidential family histories, and he said, get 2 sources. Always make sure you have 2 sources. I said, well, now that I'm starting to really dig into this, I'm finding out that a newspaper can write something, and another newspaper that's not right because they didn't get their facts, and then another newspaper comes along and uses them as their resource, and now you're going, wait, I've got 2 sources, but they're both wrong.
It's even worse than that with whiskey, because even 100 years ago, what the newspapers were publishing was very often press releases from the brands. And I'm telling you, you can go through some of these old newspapers and just find like stuff that now is just so obviously propaganda and just not true. It's really interesting. Online research is not everything it's cracked up to be. There's nothing like seeing the real document, and even better if it's handwritten. There's nothing like seeing the real document, because and there's also different newspapers have different political perspectives. So with whiskey, there may be newspapers that are in favor of temperance or even prohibition, and others who are not, and they will tell the same story 2 different ways, and your best bet is to disregard both. If you can find other evidence, see what really happened. It's really fun.
I had that actually happen. I was digging through newspapers in Bourbon County, Kentucky, and I had gone from 1812 up to about 1860, and I found very little about whiskey in it. And so we're talking about Bourbon County, Kentucky. This is, there were 12 distillers in Bourbon County, Kentucky in the 1860s. So I'm going, this seems like deaths of people who were, pretty important to the community. And I'm thinking, I finally turned around and asked the woman, because the newspaper still exists, but it's under a different name now. I said, was this a temperance paper? Because I cannot find anything on distillers that were pillars of the community and they were tied to the railroads and all sorts of other things. They were not just whiskey men, and I can't find anything on them. And she said, you know what? I sort of got that inkling in the past from what I was reading as well, because there really isn't a lot. And it's funny because it was called the Bourbon News. So you would think that they would cover whiskey, but there was another newspaper across town that did much more in terms of putting ads in and that sort of thing for the local distillers and their distilleries. So it's tricky. So as you were getting into your whiskey journey, was there you said you started with Scotch. What was your first favorite Scotch?
Talisker 10-year-old. I loved that whiskey. I still do, actually. It's changed a little bit over the years, but that whiskey was really, really great. And there was a period there just after the turn of the century when they ran out of 10-year-old Talisker. So they were putting 11 and 12-year-old Talisker in those bottles as well, and they were putting in some really peaty Talisker as well. There was a period there where you would have thought it was Lafroig or something like that.
Oh, wow.
I really liked Talisker 10. I still do.
Yeah, it's one of those that I say it's always going to be on my shelf because it's just a really nice flavor to that one. And have you been out to the distillery?
I haven't been to Skye, no.
You haven't? No, you need to go. Oh,
yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, I've been to lots
beautiful.
of Scottish distilleries, but yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose I could do them all.
That's one of my favorites.
Focus on that.
Yeah. There's a lot. So how many distilleries would you say there are in Canada right now? You had to put it.
My guess is about 250.
Okay.
And of those, probably half of them make whiskey.
Okay. So what would be would rum be something they make,
Well,
or
a lot of
gin?
A lot
Okay.
of gin. A lot of, some of them might make rum, but a lot of them make, they make odd spirits like various liqueurs and things like that. I mean, when you start a new distillery, you got to make stuff you can sell quickly. So
Yeah.
you can either sell whiskey that really doesn't taste very good and no one's going to come back, or you can sell vodka, gin, rum. But Quebec has just gone wild for gin, and they have wonderful gins there. Just amazing, yeah.
Is there a moonshine culture? I know Prohibition was kind of different in Canada in terms of it spread across the country and all of that. Was there ever an establishment of kind of a moonshine culture in any part of the country?
Yes.
Yeah.
Virtually all of the distilleries, the major distilleries that exist in Canada, began as large, well-financed organizations. They didn't start from little wee distillers. The little wee distillers, they were just kind of pushed out of business by taxes and things like that, and also because once we got good transportation, then you could buy the big distilleries whiskey quite inexpensively. But there's always been a moonshine culture, and it still exists today, and I don't think it has diminished to any extent. My electrician makes moonshine out of deer feed. He goes to the mill, buys deer feed. Some he feeds to the deer, some he puts in still, and or puts in a mash tun and then in still. And yes, and this is what happened to all of the small distillers. The small distillers in Canada, they didn't stop making stuff. They just stopped making whiskey. And they really started making moonshine. But moonshine, remember, is alcohol. It's not whiskey, And it's still out there. It's still quite common. It wouldn't take you very long to find a moonshiner pretty much anywhere that I've been in Canada.
Yeah. And it's my understanding that initially Canada was more using wheat in the early days, and then rye kind of worked its way in. What would the moonshines be made out of? Most likely corn, or
they might make it out of grain, but they might make it out of fruit or apples. Well, apples are fruit, yeah.
Okay.
Or whatever they had. I mean, they wanted alcohol, and they just distilled whatever they could get. The whiskey distilling really got its start in Ontario. That's west of Montreal. And the reason for that is that the St. Lawrence River, which flows to the Atlantic Ocean, it kind of hits a big snag at Montreal, which is called the Lachine Rapids, and it's not navigable. It wasn't then. And so anybody east of Montreal, which is all the Scottish people and Irish people and a whole bunch of others, they made rum because it's cheaper to buy Caribbean molasses and distill that, and you don't have any waste. It's sugar, and you turn it into rum. So it was only when they got to Ontario that they really started making whiskey. There were a few whiskey distillers in Quebec, yes, there were, but primarily it was rum. But the thing is that the grain that was grown in Ontario was wheat. It was wheat to be milled, to be sold, to make bread and things like that. And Ontario at that time was the wheat belt. You'll see a lot of corn growing here now, but back then it was the wheat belt. Rye was a marginal crop. They usually only grew it on poor land, and it was they used it as a cover crop, and just until the land was good enough to be properly cultivated. And so these distillers primarily they began as large, well-financed milling operations. Their business was making flour, wheat flour. They did mill some other grains, but primarily they milled wheat. Now, they're millers, and they have a lot of waste coming from making wheat, plus they have a lot of leftover grain, that they can't sell, and they were paid in wheat, so they needed to put in some kind of a waste disposal facility to get rid of the waste wheat, the extra wheat. And so what they would do is they would take all the extra wheat and they would mash it up and run it through a still and turn it into animal feed. Okay? The animal feed, it was made up of yeast and all the proteins from the grain, and it was very rich food. And of course, cattle and hogs and horses don't thrive well with a lot of carbohydrates. So once they distilled it, it was wonderful for feeding these cattle. So most of these mills had large feedlots, and they made a lot of money just selling beef or pork or whatever. But then when you distill this to make cattle feed, there's a leftover waste product that's alcohol. So they would sell this alcohol to the grocers, and the grocers would compound it. They'd add flavoring and things like this and turn it into whiskey, things like that. So it's not like they set out to make whiskey and so, hey, we're going to make whiskey.
Yeah.
Let's make wheat whiskey. It's like they set out to make flour, and what are we going to do with the stuff that's left over? It's really kind of hard to get your head around that, because today, when we think of a distillery, we think that they are in business to make whiskey, and they're going to pick the best grains to make the whiskey. Of course, a lot of these mills ultimately turned into distilleries exclusively because there's so much more profit in whiskey. Once they thought about it, they thought, you know what, we're spending a lot of money, we're losing a lot of money by giving this or selling this alcohol off to the grocers, and soon alcohol became the biggest profit center, and one after another they switched to making nothing but whiskey. And they'd close down their milling operations or just convert them over exclusively. So it really was kind of an evolution. But they didn't say, you know what, back in the old country we made moonshine, and we should make it here too, and all that. There were those people, but they never ever became commercially viable.
This is part of what I find fascinating about actually digging in and finding the real history, because, in researching Tennessee, everybody here locally talks about, oh, well, it was all the Scots-Irish came down through the mountains, and that's where the whiskey industry came from. Yet the first distiller of record that I can find is Evan Shelby, who was from Maryland, and he was distilling rye whiskey in Tennessee because that's what he knew how to distill. And it was over time that corn was just so prevalent in the state and it was easy to grow, and you had more reliability in the crop. So it was just the thing that you distilled, but also finding that if you moved to an area, if you were a pioneer, if you wanted an area to grow with settlers, you built a mill, because that mill would allow farmers to come into the area and have a place to go to mill their grain and have some of it turned into alcohol. So it wasn't really alcohol was the first idea for the Tennessean. It was, I need a place to, get my stuff milled so that I can sell it, and then I've got some excess. So very interesting to see that evolution.
Yeah. There's some interesting parallels between the growth in America and growth in Canada, because Canada wasn't settled till about 100 years after America. So you guys had lots and lots of infrastructure when we were still using boats to travel. And of course, when rivers freeze and the lakes freeze, there's no more travel. And so it really is very different. But an interesting thing about the Scots-Irish, I hear this story all the time. People say, well, Americans spell whiskey with an E because of the Scots-Irish, because the Irish spell it with an E. Well, there are two interesting things about that. Back then, they didn't spell it with an E. They didn't get that from the Irish. Number two, the Scots-Irish were lowland Scots who had been transplanted to the Ulster plantation in Scotland by King James. Why did he do that? He cleared all the Irish out of there, and those were Scottish settlements in Ulster. And he did that because they were Presbyterians, and he was fighting the Catholics. And that was it was as simple as that. So it's and this is another thing that just people put two and two together and they come up with five every time. That's why you have to do your research and don't jump to conclusions, because invariably you're going to get something twisted, and then it becomes the lore, and after it's the lore, it becomes the fact. And many of our facts really are not even remotely true.
I did. I actually went in and did some really deep research on the E, and what's interesting is that, as you say, Scotland was spelling without an E, England was spelling with an E around the time that the Americans were starting to spell it with an E, but then it shifted, and through the 19th century in the U.S., it was predominantly spelled without an E. And so when you see brands like Old Forester, and they still spell it without an E, if you go on the tour, they say, oh, that's because we're, embracing our Scotch heritage. No, it's not that. It's that's how, when the brand was created, they spelled whiskey. And it's just slowly evolved into now. But if you look in the law, in American law, you will find in the U.S. law books, whiskey spelled without an E in a lot of cases. So even codified into our law, it is. But so now you can answer this question for me, because this is one that I have heard that I'm not sure. I've never seen the facts on this. But Scotland and Canada are the only two countries that actually mandate that whiskey has to be spelled without an E. Is that true?
It's absolutely, totally garbage. It's not true. We have brands up here who spell it. There is no requirement to spell. You can spell W-I-S-K-I if you want. There's no requirement. No requirement.
I love that.
You have to spell it that way. None whatsoever. And if you go to Scotland and look at the original Scotch whiskey order, you'll see it was spelled with an E in the original. I think that was in the 17th century, with an E. And then in the document, it's spelled sometimes with and sometimes without. It was just plain illiteracy.
Right.
People why is the Cutty Sark label yellow? Because the printer made an error, and it's been that way all along. Why is whiskey spelled with an E? Because somebody who was illiterate started putting it on labels, and nobody gives a hoot. Who cares?
Well, it's so funny, because one of the big myths is that the Dublin Four, when they were trying to dismiss grain whiskey, decided to spell whiskey with an E because they wanted to separate it from the country distillers and all the rest. Well, as I'm digging into all of this, the obvious clue is that when you read their books, The Truth About Whiskey, where they were talking down grain whiskey, they spell whiskey without an E. So if they were trying to pump an E into it, why didn't they use an E on their book?
Well, I think the thing that we really need to worry about a lot more than that is, why do you guys not spell donut with a GH in it? That's wrong. Well, and yogurt, Y-O-G-H-U-R-T. Why do you do that? And color, where's the U in color? It's
right.
Different ways of spelling
dialogue
exactly
with
the same thing. Spelling
dialogue,
exactly
G-U-E. Why? You know what's funny is I was doing research into John Adams and how we ended up with our system of measures, and he was seriously looking at the metric system way back in 1824, but it just, in the end, he ended up just giving up. He wrote a paper on it and then dropped it, and it took a little while longer before the rules were made. But it's just funny to look at that and see, because I grew up in Detroit, and so we were learning the metric system when I was a kid, and then I moved to South Carolina, and it's like there's no need for it. And I would spell words like dialogue, G-U-E, and people would say, why are you spelling it like that? And I said, well, that's how you spell it, isn't it? And they go, no. And then I looked it up and went, oh, I'm being so close to Canada, we picked up a lot of Canadian spellings, and so of that English, old English spelling, and so it's just funny how we take some of those things for granted, but then once you really sort of dig in and figure out where all that stuff comes from, and that I had that connection, it's kind of fun now. I just continue to spell it the Canadian/English way instead, and it raises fun conversation pieces. So, but. So interesting that when I went to Canada, the only distillery that I've been to in Canada, and I say been to but not into, is the one in Gimli, the Crown Royal plant. Because I went up there and I was like, oh, I need to go see a distillery while I'm here. Of course, I didn't contact anybody ahead of time. and I was coming with a Kentucky sense that there was probably some kind of a visitor's attraction when you got there. And I showed up and I'm at a factory. And so I said, okay, I'm not really going to get a chance to see this. What's funny is I had the rest of the day to try to figure out what to do, and found out there was a snake event. The Narcissus Snake Den was having their breeding thing going on. So you could walk around a field filled with snakes and watch balls of snakes mating, which is, I guess, what you do when you're in Upper Manitoba trying to find something to do.
I'd love to work the smell of that into a tasting note. Garter snakes have that funny smell when you handle them. Your hands smell afterwards. I bet you when you got like a couple of thousand of them all, mating and so on, I bet you it's exciting. Yeah, it's hard to have a visitor center when the distilleries are so far apart, because you don't get enough tourists to support it. And if you're going to have a visitor center, then the place has to be safe. Okay, so either they all wear steel-toed boots, or you have to make passages where nothing can fall on them, particularly barrels and things like that. And, they have to wear a hard hat. And the stills are insanely hot. So you have to keep them away from that as well. Health and safety regulations in Canada say that most pot stills have to have fiberglass batting around them so nobody accidentally gets burned. So it's a really different thing here. If you want to put in, if you want them to be a tourist attraction, then you have to accept your insurance rates are going to be astronomically higher, and that you're going to have staff to look after them, and that you're going to have facilities for them. And then when you have facilities, you have to have all kinds of facilities for them. And people are going to get hungry, and, things are going to happen, So I think in a country like Scotland, it makes eminently good sense to have visitor centers. The same in Kentucky, where you have enough distilleries that people can go out and they can visit 3 or 4 distilleries in a day and spend money at each one of them. The other problem, of course, is that until the pandemic hit, most of these distilleries were not permitted to sell whiskey. So they could sell souvenirs and things like that, but the government wanted to sell the whiskey. So it's really, it's kind of a different thing. And people still shouldn't come here expecting to find a visitor center at the major distilleries. But at the small distillers, yes, most of them have a restaurant or a bar, something like that. And it's a lot easier doing it that way.
Yeah.
But
Is there
an
like
amazing distillery?
Yeah, I would love to go see it one of these days, and definitely don't want to take that big long drive out there just to find out I can't get in the door. But that it's the big plants are always very interesting to see that scale, but then also see the smaller ones and see it at that scale as well. Would you say most of the smaller craft distillers are using hybrid stills and pot stills, or are they using some form of column at some of them?
I'd say you probably wouldn't want to say most about anything, because they each have their own personalities. But yes, you have hybrid stills, you have pot stills, and you also have quite a few of the small distillers using columns, but they're short columns, like it may be like 5 trays, a 5-tray column or something like that, which is great. It's like a beer still at a large distillery, except it's a little bit shorter. So you're still getting really very flavorful whiskey or spirit coming out of them. Some of them will have tall, quite tall, skinny stainless steel column stills, which they use primarily for making white spirits, for making vodka, and for making white spirits that they can then turn into something else. So it's a real mixed bag, and there are some really beautiful pot stills in some of those little distilleries as well.
So when you're doing a distillation through a 5-tray column still like that, are they also doing the bourbon thing of putting it in a thumper or a doubler, or do they maybe run it through that still 2 times to maybe get a lighter spirit, or is there a process there that is, again, not to say standard, but it's interesting to see the different ways that different countries have developed systems and processes.
I think thumpers are pretty rare up here because most of them have a condenser after. They'll go to a doubler, but then they'll go to a condenser. So it's not really like a thumper. But a lot of them they'll do a run through the columns, then collect that spirit and do a second run just in a pot, for example.
Okay.
Yeah, or they'll run it in a like the equivalent of a beer still, and then put it into a pot. So they'll do a stripping run first, and it's really quite an interesting process. But it's not really analogous to what they're doing in Kentucky at all.
Okay,
But some of them do have doublers, but most of them are pretty small, and they don't, they'll just do 2 runs.
Yeah, I think about that, and I think about, again, Ireland and what's going on there. But I think the Irish rules, again, sort of restrict in terms of what you can do from column still or pot still. Same with Scotland, and that you have maybe less of that in Canada because you are using different size stills. But I mean, I've seen hybrid stills in Ireland. I know that I think it was Loch Lomond got in trouble at one point for trying to make a grain spirit in a hybrid still, or a Lomond still as they called it.
Yeah, I remember those also, but I don't remember it. I don't remember the controversy. I think that when you talk about restrictions on Scottish distillers, you tend to lapse again into forgetting that most Scottish whiskey is blended whiskey, and most of it is distilled in massive, tall column stills. And they really, if you're talking single malts, there are different. Those are regulated in a different way. But I think if you're talking Scotch whiskey, I don't really know the regulations, but I do know that the majority of whiskey in Scotland is made in massive column stills and then blended afterwards. We fall into the same trap as we do when we talk about American whiskey, but only think about straight bourbon,
Right. Yeah, we see those pot stills and we think that's the way it is.
Yeah, and that's very much promoted to draw in the tourist.
Yeah. Well, column stills aren't always sexy. Sometimes they are. I've seen some really nice looking column stills, but sometimes they look, I say, like a large flute, just sitting there hanging out, look in the windows, and that's what you get.
A really good description, like a large flute. Yeah,
just a big flute. Yep.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have whiskey around you or not. I got 2 bottles. I had to hunt everywhere, and I took a picture while I was up in Kentucky because I was at a Total Wine, and I was looking at the Canadian section. First, you have to find the Canadian section. It's like, okay, where? There's the Irish. Oh, it's behind the Irish. Okay, there we go. And then once you find it, it's like you have Crown Royal. You've got your. You may find like a J.P. Weiser, but I didn't even find that. All I was finding was Canadian Club and a lot of the really big names that and it's like that's a real struggle because if somebody wants to get into Canadian whiskey and there's already a mystery around it because people haven't been exposed to anything but the big names, how do you get people into other smaller distilleries like 40 Creek, which is what I have here to taste, and really get to explore Canadian whiskey without driving across the border and going to buy a bottle?
Well, let me say that last year at the Canadian Whisky Awards, which is a blind competition judged by 10 people who really know Canadian whiskey, the winning whiskey was Crown Royal Winter Wheat. And it's a wonderful, wonderful whiskey. It really is. And it beat some fabulous whiskeys to win that. The year before that, it was Canadian Club 43-year-old. Canadian Club 43-year-old is just, it's an elegant whiskey as well as just very broad in its flavors. So their Canadian Club and Crown Royal are both really top-end producers, and they're also, of course, as you mentioned, the best-selling Canadian whiskies. 40 Creek has won a couple of times with their Confederation Oak, 40 Creek Confederation Oak. In fact, they won Canadian Whisky of the Decade in 2020. And so it's I think that what's happening there is maybe in America they associate those brand names with maybe the bottom shelf whiskeys that those brands put out. Although if you go to Texas, I mean, you can get some fabulous Crown Royal hand-selected barrel. I did a tasting there once with 6 different hand-selected barrels. Oh my goodness, it was just wonderful. And you know, there's so it really kind of depends on the stores that you're going to, and it's more of, I think, of a pull strategy there. 40 Creek has done remarkably well in the United States. It's huge in Texas. You go to New Orleans, I bet you can't find a bar that doesn't have 40 Creek in it.
Really?
It's
Okay.
really good stuff. Although since Campari bought it, they've put a little bit more focus on wild turkey, and I think it has maybe lost some profile in America, but in Canada it's still big whiskey. You know, 40
Okay.
Creek. And you said you were tasting 40 Creek and Weiser, so I brought one of each with me.
Oh, nice.
And,
okay.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I bet you that from that bottle, that looks almost like it's copper pot or copper bowl.
It is the Copper Pot Reserve. So
Okay.
43 ABV. And I saw the Campari thing on there, and I thought, I wonder if that's why maybe, you know, in the U.S. it's all about distributors and what states they can get into. And if if Campari buys them, this is what the Irish distillers are dealing with. A lot of them are starting to be bought up, and then they start showing up on our shelves because they're associated with a brand that's already got distribution into these markets. So,
Well, it
so where
certainly
is
helps.
so where is 40 Creek?
They're in Grimsby, Ontario, which is not very far from Hamilton, which is not very far from. It's a 1-hour drive from Toronto.
Go Tiger Cats. I have this obsession with, coming from Detroit, I have this obsession with Tiger teams. So when I was in Canada, I got myself a Hamilton Tiger Cats shirt because I said, all right, there's the Tiger team for me.
Yeah. Well, I went to Detroit and saw Tigers as well.
Yeah.
They were swinging a bat.
Yes. Actually, it's funny because if you go to that stadium, it's like an homage to Tigers. There are tiger heads all over that ballpark.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
So what do you smell in this?
So this one is really interesting because it has, I mean, I get rye, but I get butterscotch. And that butterscotch is, very strong on the nose on this one. Well,
those are oak caramels. When you if you don't overchar the oak, the oak is made up of long chain carbohydrates, and they caramelize, and they add a lot of sweetness to whiskey. And I mean, that's where most of the sweetness comes from. That's why bourbon is so sweet, because they use brand new oak, so it hasn't even had a chance to wash out. So that's where you're getting that from.
So talk about this whiskey as much as you know in terms of like what do we talk about with the grains that they're probably using in here? Is this a blend of something that came out of a pot still and also grain, or is it was it distilled in both?
It's a blend of something that came from a pot still and something that came from a column still. Well, it's quite a few different components. In Canada, we tend to blend quite a few different components into a whiskey because that way, every year, of course, the flavor of the grain changes. So you just adjust the components so you can keep a consistent profile from one year to the next. And so, this is a blended whiskey.
And you're talking about a area that some areas in Canada, and I'm wondering now where the northernmost distillery is and how they would handle barrels, because one of the advantages to Kentucky is that you're going to get the temperature swings. It's going to age a lot faster. In Canada, I would imagine 3 years is the rule, because if you're getting it under 3 years, you're probably not getting. I mean, usually the first.
Conclusions. Don't jump to
there you go.
conclusions. The aging law
There you
was
go.
put in strictly to facilitate collection of taxes, because people were
Okay.
selling white whiskey and not paying their taxes on it. So the revenuers knew if they found somebody with white spirits, they hadn't paid their taxes because they had to sit in the barrel for 2 years, and then they upped it to 3 years.
Okay.
And also think about what happened. What happened at Heaven Hill a few years ago? Didn't it catch fire?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we have fire suppression systems in our distilleries, and water freezes, so they have to keep the distilleries above the freezing point so that they don't burst the pipes in the fire suppression system. Okay, some of them are starting to go to dry fire suppression. They use chemicals rather than water. But most of the warehouses are heated, and they kept it between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius. By the way, we have metric here, and I'm not a fan. But anyways, so you do get some movement of the whiskey in the barrels as well. Whiskey, a warehouse full of whiskey is a huge heat sink. So it takes months and months and months for it to get cold enough in there that the whiskey's not maturing. And in the summertime, it takes time for it to go up. But of course, in the summer, you get big changes between day and night, so you get breathing and so on going on.
Yeah.
We do have a distillery in Canada that has a dunnage warehouse that's unheated, and it takes like 10 years to get 5-year-old whiskey there. But
is that in Nova Scotia? I would imagine that climate would be. Would it?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just guessing because I've been to Nova Scotia. I love Nova Scotia, and I'm thinking it's very weather-wise. It feels very Scottish, Irish to me in terms of its climate.
Yeah, there's a large area of Nova Scotia where the road signs are in Gaelic.
Ah, okay.
In Gaelic.
Okay, interesting. I had done a trip many, many years ago where I took the ferry across to Newfoundland and drove all the way up to St. Anthony. And it was a great trip, but it was short because I basically had one day up and one day back down. But driving through Nova Scotia on that trip to get up to that area, and then once I was in Newfoundland, I thought I was in Scotland because the accents and just kind of the personality. But then this quirkiness that everything is a half hour off because they're, for some reason, and I don't know to this day why, Newfoundland is a half hour off from the rest of the world.
And they can't figure out why we're a half hour off. It's just like I know, it's cool. It's really funny, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, because it's like the bottom. You hear the news come on at the bottom of the hour, and you're thinking it's the top of the hour, and you're like, "Oh no, wait, I'm in Newfoundland. It's different here."
So they've used some new barrels, mostly barrels that have been used before, and they've also finished some of the whiskey in sherry barrels that have held sherry, and it's actually not really sherry; it's wine from the Niagara region. So that's why you're getting those fruity notes in this as well.
Wow, there's a really nice grain note in this that comes out with all the sweetness of the butterscotch, and then I get some of that, what I call maple, in there. But it's really kind of it's a woody note that's coming in, but it's a sweet woody note that I'm pulling in.
I have to say that I think that this kind of goes a little bit in the maple direction. I'm not saying I would call it maple, but it's more than butterscotch for sure.
And then it's got like this peppery note at the end. It's a very strong peppery note that hit me, especially the first time I drink it. After you've had a couple of sips of it, it kind of tamps down a bit. But initially, it's almost like a shock at that peppery note that comes in.
Yeah. I generally find that the first sip of whiskey kind of gets your mouth ready for the second sip, and I find that I can taste more on the second sip. And I think that when you're tasting, see there I'm getting it now, when you're tasting Canadian whiskey, there were kind of 3 touchstones, like there are 10,000 different flavors you can find in Canadian whiskey, but most of them start off very sweet with those oak caramels. Yeah. A whole bunch of things happen, and then they get really peppery and hot. you really get that spiciness. Some of that comes from rye, and some of that just comes from the alcohol in the whiskey stimulating your trigeminal nerve in your tongue, and those are pain sensors. It's the same sensation that makes Mexican food enjoyable, or
Cajun food, that kind of
Cajun,
thing. Yeah.
whatever, yeah. And then at the end, you tend to get kind of a bitter, pithy, like it's like the white pith of a grapefruit. If you after you had your grapefruit, or you can even just pull out the sections and just eat the pulp of the grapefruit, and it's just slightly bitter and pithy, and it kind of just dries your mouth out and it kind of gets you ready for the next one. That is the typical profile of Canadian whiskey. But as I say, there are 10,000 other things you taste in between.
This is the fun part about whiskey. We get an opportunity to taste different regions and different experiences with it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is, I think this is a very nice whiskey.
Yeah, it's affordable. I mean, it's not a high priced whiskey. I don't remember how much I paid. I think I paid like $40 US for it. So somewhere in that range. Very nice. And then kind of jumping back a little bit into the history and talking about a situation where we make assumptions. When I was doing some research on Sam Brofman, and interesting to note for people that don't know who he is and that his ties to Seagram's, especially after I guess he bought into Seagram's in 1928. And then once Prohibition was over, he started buying up American distilleries, and this is where we get Four Roses with their 5 yeast strains, because they all came during the time that Brofman was buying up the Henry McKenna distillery and the Atherton distillery and the Old Prentice distillery, which is where they make Four Roses now. And so really interesting to kind of learn that bit of history. But I stumbled into something where I don't know if I'd read this or heard this, that prior to that, they were doing bootlegging, and that it was legal to make whiskey in Canada, but Canada was in Prohibition at the same time, and actually earlier than the United States was in Prohibition. But then Canada sort of slowly, there were pockets, like maybe different provinces that broke out of Prohibition earlier. This is all fuzzy to me. Do you can you kind of break that down a little bit? When did Canada go into Prohibition, and how did it break out?
Yeah, Canada never went into Prohibition as a country. Okay.
Okay.
Because it's the regulations up here are different. The federal government regulates the shipping and transport of and sale of alcohol. Pardon me, shipping and transport of alcohol, manufacturing of alcohol, but the provinces are responsible for sales. So what happened is individual provinces introduced Prohibition. It didn't last very long in any of them. It was partly because the feds controlled the distribution. So people would buy whiskey or make whiskey in Alberta, in Saskatchewan legally, and then they would sell it in Alberta where it was not legal, or sell it in Manitoba where it was not legal to make it. But so what happened, and when Ontario went dry, all that happened is that the people who would move to Quebec would buy whiskey that was manufactured in Ontario, have it shipped to them in Montreal, and then they would ship it back to Ontario to people through a mail order business, because the manufacture and sale are controlled by 2 different arms of government which didn't agree. And it was never very popular in Canada in any case, except in Prince Edward Island, where it lasted for decades. But it was never very popular. It was very short-lived here. It was pretty violent for a while in the Toronto-Hamilton area. But for most people, it was, it didn't stop them from getting booze legally. It didn't stop them from getting booze legally. They couldn't be arrested for owning booze or for buying booze if they bought it out of province. And so, it really was, I think, the best way to do Prohibition, because it's very ineffective. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
there was that.
and
And Bronfman started they started it was really a compounding unit in Saskatchewan where they would buy alcohol and add some flavoring, add some imported whiskey, like imported rye or imported Scotch, mix it all together, slap labels on it, and then they take it down to the border to the States, and the people would come up to Canada. In Canada, we could legally sell this whiskey to those people. It's not our job to monitor what they do with it afterwards. Then they would drive across the border and sell it in the States. It was really everything was completely, totally legal in Canada.
Yeah, in Canada.
Yeah. But it was illegal for them to sell to the Americans. There was no law against that.
So I read this thing that said that in 1930 that the American government, the U.S. government, I always like to say the U.S. government, not the American government, because Canadians are Americans too, just a different country, different government. But you're
well, I guess I'll see you later.
Okay. I've ruffled feathers already. No, really interesting.
Feathers left a ruffle.
Sure. But that in 1930, the American or the U.S. government had just gotten fed up with this whiskey coming across the border and had lobbied the Canadian government to make a law that said that you cannot ship whiskey to a country that is in prohibition. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that is the story that is told when we talk about Bronfman sending his whiskey to Saint-Pierre, the little French island off of Newfoundland, to ship it there so that it could get to the rum runners through France instead of through Canada, so that it would be legal for the Canadians to sell it to the French, but then the French would basically turn around and sell it to the Americans through the U.S. through New York.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a myth. The Canadians could sell it to anybody they wanted to, but very often they would say they were going to Cuba, go from Windsor to Cuba, or go to the Bahamas, or go to some other place like that, and then they would just go across the river. It's only a mile. Drop off their whiskey, come back and get another load in the next one. As long as they had the paperwork, that was fine. And as long as they had somebody in Cuba sign that they received it, it was no problem. And of course, that was all set up in advance. But the Canadian government and the American government, it wasn't a law. They made a friendly agreement that Canada would inhibit the sales or the shipment of whiskey into the United States. Okay? Because it was really getting kind of bloody. And, you had the American Coast Guard in the Great Lakes and so on, and they were shooting people and blowing them up, things like this. And so what they did is they closed down the export docks. So you could no longer operate an export dock. And that essentially, and it would be around 1930, that essentially ended the shipment of Canadian whiskey easily into the States. But on the East Coast and the West Coast, they would fill up huge boats, with whiskey, and they would anchor outside of American waters, and American boats would come out, load up, and go back in, and it was their problem. It was legal to sell whiskey on the high seas, and the Canadian government tried to cooperate with the American government, but they didn't put an end to it. Saint-Pierre was a good staging point for selling whiskey down the coast, because you could load up boats there. They had strong merchant marine, and you could sail down the coast, and just boats could come out and get the whiskey, and it was really easy to do that. They did the same thing on the West Coast as well, sailing out of Vancouver and out of Victoria down the West Coast. Boats would come out and buy the whiskey. But yeah, I mean, the Canadian government, the Canadians try to be, good neighbors with the Americans, and I think that the Americans lobbied successfully, but there was never a law saying you couldn't sell whiskey to the States. They just closed the facilities that were doing it. Most of the facilities. Yeah.
I think this is the tough part about writing a history book and trying to do a whiskey podcast where you're dispelling all these myths, is that after a while you're almost afraid to open your mouth, because you go, sooner or later, I'm going to probably find out what I'm saying right now isn't true. But that's also something that's interesting about history itself, is that it evolves as we learn more. So,
always be
it doesn't
prepared to
stand
be
pat.
proven wrong. Yeah.
Yes.
Because somebody else is reading a book you haven't heard about yet, or they found an archive you didn't know about.
Yeah.
And they're in there.
I did a whole story on one of my podcasts about the myth of the flatboats going down to New Orleans in the 1700s and taking barrels of whiskey down, early 1800s. And I said, it's interesting, as I looked it up, I didn't realize, but the Spanish controlled the Mississippi River because the French had lost it in the French and Indian War. And so the Spanish held it. And then I went, well, wait a second, but how did Napoleon sell it to the Americans? And then as I really started digging into the history, I found out that the French only owned it for about a month in the early 1800s, and he basically flipped it for to the Americans in a quick deal. He ended up getting Tuscany in exchange for Louisiana, and then flipped it and made a quick buck off of it from selling it to Thomas Jefferson. So, but that, again, when you start picking up these little bits of history, and then I find out that there was actually a treaty in 1795 that did open up the waters to American traders up and down the river. But prior to that, Spain really wanted nothing going down that river without their permission. So it's those little pieces of history that you make assumptions, and then all of a sudden a fact comes out. And I ended up having to redo part of that episode because I said, it's not right, and I don't want it to be out there and not be right. It's tougher with a book because once you put it in the book, you can't just go make an edit and it edits the thing across unless you got a Kindle book. But beyond that, you can't really just make a quick edit to a book. So you got to get it right the first time as best as you can.
Well, I had some, I think, significant errors in my first edition, because I listened to what one of the brands told me, and they had their own version of their history, and it just wasn't true. And since then, I've been very careful, because people can make very convincing arguments. I think so. I think you learn also how to read information just as I care.
Yeah.
That was the first edition that came out.
Okay.
In, I think, 2012 or something like that. There were some things in there that kind of got away from me, because I just people were so very helpful, but sometimes it was marketing and not actually history. But when you're talking about bourbon going in barrels down the Mississippi, ask yourself when they started putting spirits in oak in Europe, and then ask yourself why the Americans had to reinvent that. They didn't.
Yeah. I did a whole episode about Madeira and how all this whiskey aged at sea, and this idea that some Baptist preacher in Kentucky discovered in his burned out grist mill a barrel that he just decided to throw some whiskey in, and just for the heck of it, to see what happened. And all of a sudden, we should age in barrels. And I'm thinking, well, when they brought the Mayflower across, they brought spirits with them. They brought beer with them. How were they putting it into that barrel? They were probably cauterizing that barrel. And then once they did that, they put the spirit in there so that it would make the trip. So it's like, it's just common sense. But we are so told these stories over and over, and they're so fun that maybe our brain just says, I just like that story so much, I'm not really going to pay attention to the fact that there's no way that could be possibly true.
Yeah, well, they also make sense. They're logical. But people, it's human nature to want to fill in the blanks in a story. And that's an urge that a historian has to resist. You
Yeah.
can't,
Yeah.
you could say, maybe they did this, maybe this is why, but you can't just say this is what happened. And you have to be really careful, because somebody else is going to take what you wrote and they're going to make it smaller and just pick out key points and things like that. And so it's
It's
that's
tricky.
why it took me so long to write the first edition, because it's just the learning curve was just very, very steep. So much,
Yeah.
and having to discard things that I explanations that I thought made sense. But anyways, Drew, that's the way it goes. It's that's what's the fun of it. And you're right. History changes. I say history is a conversation, because somebody else is going to tell you something that is just a little bit more accurate someday.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think I've started my Tennessee book. I started writing it 3 times, trying to get tone. And then as I started getting in and writing it, I found I was writing a Tennessee history book, because you can't really tell the story of Tennessee whiskey without sort of getting an idea that the fact that it wasn't Tennessee until 1796. So all of that prehistory is all North Carolina history, or it was known, I didn't know this either, it was known as the territory south of the River Ohio. That was its official name from 1790 to 1796, but everybody just called it the Southwest Territory because that was easier. But then you start talking about the first distiller in Tennessee, you can't really say that he was the first distiller in Tennessee, because he never ever saw anything called Tennessee. He died before Tennessee even became the name of some land form. And so it's like these are all pieces that you go, okay, how detailed do I want to get in this? But honestly, you need to know a little history, general history sometimes. And to me, the fun part is that then whiskey returns the favor, because so much of whiskey history has influenced regular history. So, dealing with our taxes or dealing with uprisings and all of that. So just really fascinating to dig in.
Yeah, whiskey sure paid the bills for our government in the early days.
Yeah.
It was the largest source of taxes in Canada for a long time.
Well, what's funny is that, and I brought this point up, and that prior to, the reason we have an income tax is because they knew the Prohibition was coming at some point, and our revenue in the U.S. was only coming from tariffs and the excise tax on whiskey and spirits. And so they knew they were going to lose that, and when they ended up voting in the income tax, I find it very telling that in 1933, when they repealed Prohibition, they didn't repeal the income tax. They decided that nobody even questioned it. They just were so used to paying the income tax that, a generation had passed and nobody thought to question it. Why are we still paying this tax? Of course, we were in the middle of a depression, too, so that probably any revenue the government could keep their hands on. But just an interesting little piece of history to think, okay, why didn't people question that? So I have brought out my JP. So I have brought out my JP Weiser. Now this, when I walked into the store and I bought the 40 Creek, the store owner came over to me and he said, "Oh well, if you're looking for Canadian whiskey, you should try this, because this is a special one that they only had a certain lot of it that they made, and they were offering it in large quantities, but just to certain stores. So if you had a chain of stores, they would offer it as a barrel pick, basically, kind of a situation. So this one's called Signature Series. It's a blended Canadian whiskey. It's 86.6 proof. And so I'm guessing you don't have anything specific to this, but maybe...
Let's see that label. Let's see the label on that. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Something unique. So talk a little about J.P. Weiser. J.P. Weiser is a historic brand that has been that was one of the early ones. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Maybe we talk about J.P. Weiser and Molson, because Molson, I think, was the first big distiller Was he a distiller before he was a brewer, or was
No,
he?
they were brewers for ages before they started making
Okay.
whiskey. It
Yeah.
was the second generation that made whiskey. And they made
Okay.
malt whiskey because they were a brewery, so they had malt, so they made malt whiskey. And they also made whiskey using a mash bill as well. And,
Okay.
they used the sour mash process to make their whiskey because back then sanitation was terrible. So to prevent infection, they used sour mash because with sour mash the pH is low, so bacteria can't grow very quickly. So that's how they were doing that. They really became a massively huge distillery in Montreal, they were shipping whiskey like crazy overseas, and they were shipping whiskey into Canada, the rest of Canada, and into the States, and so on. And but they kind of just lost interest in 1867. It was the biggest profit center in the business, and yet when Thomas Molson died, it was kind of inevitable that they were going to go broke, go out of business, and they just went back to making beer, and they're still one of the biggest beer makers in Canada. Still one of the biggest breweries by far, yeah.
It was mind-blowing when I read they made whiskey, because they are so known for making beer that their whiskey history is kind of faded into the distant past.
Yeah. It's so far
this is
back. Okay, go ahead. Sure.
Well, I was going to say this J.P. Weiser is a 4-grain, so it's corn, wheat, rye, and barley.
Oh, okay.
And it has been aged in and it's been aged in bourbon casks and new oak.
Yeah.
Blended for a unique rye profile, it says, and on the nose there is definitely an herbally rye.
Uh-huh.
And it's not sweet on the nose. It's just that very nice herbal character that I love in rye. And then there's a little like toasted caramel note as well.
Yeah. Well, I brought up J.P. Weiser's 15-year-old, but now that you tell me about that whiskey, I'm pretty sure I know what it is, and it's not sold as Weiser's in Canada.
Oh, is it not?
If it's the same whiskey, I think it is a 4-grain whiskey that doesn't have that sweetness at the beginning. And it's, by the way, one of my favorite whiskeys for just sipping on.
Ah, okay.
But I'm enjoying my 15-year-old.
Mm. Yeah, this has the rye is the star of the show on this. It does have some nice sweetness to it, but unlike the other that was really almost that syrupy butterscotch note coming through, this one has a sweetness, but it's the rye sweetness that I taste coming through, and it's like that toffee is just off in the corners saying, "Hey, I'm here."
Let me ask you some questions, because now I'm really curious. Are you getting some notes that are kind of like bread, kind of like white bread? Can you imagine that? White bread, or maybe donuts?
That's interesting.
Like that?
Maybe more donuts than white bread. Yeah.
Just take I'm
a plain cake donut guy, so.
Oh, it's not cake donuts; it's bread donuts. Taste a little bit more right now, and then I'll ask you another question.
Okay.
Now, if you rub your tongue against the roof of your mouth, is it slippery?
A little bit, but not excessively.
Slippery, okay. Yeah, but it's not like bourbon or like something like that. It's
right.
That's slippery, yeah. Okay, good.
I was going to say that's something I've never really thought to test before. What I love is I do love a great mouthfeel, something that lays heavy on the palate.
Okay,
that's always one of the. Yeah.
Is there any nuttiness in that? It could be grain. It could just taste like cereal. Okay, yeah.
It's more of that. It is. Yeah, it's a little more of a cereal grain than it is the oak. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. It's really interesting because again, it's challenging my opinions on Canadian whiskey and giving me, two different whiskeys here that have their own personalities to them. and that I can sort of relate to some American whiskeys, but not actually. When I think of the butterscotch in the first one, I think of more of like the Johnny Walker Red butterscotch that really comes out sweet in front for me. For me, Johnny Walker Red's one of those whiskeys that it's like, okay, you know, I mean, if I want butterscotch flavor, I will drink that. It's not my favorite whiskey in the world, but it's one of those that brings a particular note. And I love those whiskeys that I go, okay, if I'm in the mood for this flavor, which one do I go grab? What's going to bring that to me? So I now have my 40 Creek for my butterscotch cravings.
Yeah. Good.
So.
Yeah, I'm enjoying that. My JP Weiser's 15-year-old as well. The thing, you know, with the big distilleries is bad whiskey just doesn't get out because there are so many quality control points in the process that at any point they can just say, you know what, we're going to redistill this and make it into vodka. And
we think we talk about Seagrams and we talk about you know, in the U.S. we have so many sourced whiskeys that come out of MGP, and you know that plant has been making whiskey forever, so they're gonna know what they're doing. And it's so. And I hear somebody say, "Oh, it's a sourced whiskey." I go, "Well, it's good whiskey." I think the only drawback to it is that there are too many distilleries using it, and so it's like you go buy this $80 bottle of what you think is a craft spirit, and it ended up coming from MGP, and you're like, "Oh, I could go buy a $30 or $40 bottle that was made by, you know, at the same place," and you go, "Is it really worth me spending the money to do this, to get this particular whiskey?" And it makes me wonder too, in Canada with the growth, because this has happened in Ireland and it's happened in Kentucky and it's happened in a lot of places, especially Tennessee, where as the industry has grown so quickly, you talked about some of the distilleries doing gin and vodkas and maybe even rum, but is there a distillery that is providing a lot of juice to these, like an MGP or like Great Northern Distillery does in Ireland, that this growth of Canadian whiskey, a lot of it is maybe tied to a source that is providing a lot of the whiskey for these as startups?
Well, I think that most of the large distilleries will sell bulk whiskey. Most of them sell bulk whiskey.
Okay.
And some brands buy that. Maybe not distillers, but some brands will buy that bulk whiskey. What's interesting is that they don't always buy it from the same place. You know, they buy from a broker, first of all, and they'll buy for a flavor profile. So it may not always come from all of it from the same place. And because Canadian whiskey is blended, they can adjust the ratios of the different components so they can get the same flavor, even if one batch comes from part of one batch comes from this distillery, the next time that part comes from a different distillery. But I think most of the large distilleries do. There's whiskey out there on the market that is whiskey that is brilliantly great whiskey that just didn't meet the specs for the brands that a particular large distillery makes. And so they sell it, and somebody else releases it under their name. And one of the reasons that people don't put the name of the distillery on there is because the distilleries tell them that I don't want you putting my name on your whiskey, because if you take it and you screw it up, I don't want it coming back on me. You know, once it leaves my door, you finish it the way you want, you mature it the way you want, you blend it the way you want, but don't put my name on it. People think that the producers are trying to hide that they bought the whiskey, but it's really the distillers who are saying, we'll sell you. Macallan does this, or used to do this. They used to sell Macallan whiskey. You could buy Macallan from different places, but it never had a mention of Macallan on it.
Oh, okay.
Because Macallan wanted to protect their house style and their brand. And the Canadian distillers do the same, and I imagine a lot of American distillers do the same as well.
Yeah, because it's interesting. It says product of Canada on the label, and there's this real drive in the U.S. now to say, well, if it came from a particular state, it should say what state it came from, so that we can guess if it says product of Indiana, that it might likely come from MGP, and to build that kind of transparency in it. And it is interesting.
I don't see that as transparency, because there are a billion other things that you don't think to ask about. I think it's people know about this, and so everybody jumps on that bandwagon. Just like years ago, they jumped on the caramel coloring bandwagon, and they jumped on the sulfur bandwagon until they realized that every grain of corn is loaded with sulfur. They jump on these, and I think that people they get something to fixate on. Now, I honestly don't understand why people are so bent out of shape about people buying whiskey from somebody else and then bottling it themselves, particularly if they add value to that whiskey they've purchased, be it flavor or even marketing in a different way. I don't understand that, but I know there's a paper written recently that talks about what Americans think of when they think about authentic whiskey is that the whiskey was distilled, every drop of whiskey was distilled by the people who are selling it. And I think that 99.999% of those people don't realize that those distillers are also allowed to add flavoring to their whiskey, because they don't have to report that. They don't have to tell you that they're doing that. So I think there's so many things there that you don't know about. To get bent out of shape about sourcing is just like, great. Then the distillers must love it, because they can do the 1,001 other things that they're not transparent about.
It's so funny because, people would talk about Jack Daniels and say, Jack Daniels, and they have this vision of Jack and his hat and his beard, and, that here's this guy, every drop of whiskey he was making was his own, or whatever he sold was his own. But that wasn't the case in Lincoln County. When he got started, the distillers, if one was short of this or whatever, they were trading whiskey between them. So it was like you sometimes knew where the best quality stuff came from, and so you would have particular trading partners, but they were all trading whiskey back and forth. And I laugh about how George Dickel and Jack Daniels have this rivalry, or that there's this tension I feel in the air sometimes when I'm down in that area. Yet the bonders who were blending the whiskeys, the grocers up in Nashville, were likely blending together Jack Daniel's whiskey and George Dickel's whiskey into the same bottle. So, it just wasn't as important back then as we've now gotten to this need for excess information, because we have the ability to get it, I guess, is probably the primary reason.
And also remember that for a long time they weren't selling it in bottles. They were selling it in barrels or other containers. Because bottles were just too expensive.
I think that was something I read this, and I'm not sure if this is that Canada had a Bottled in Bond Act actually prior, like in the 1880s rather than the 1890s.
We did have a Bottled in Bond Act, but really that was just a way for distillers to avoid paying taxes until they actually sold their whiskey.
Okay.
So you could put it in a government warehouse. You built the warehouse, and the government put a little sign on the door. And, we had a Bottled in Bond Act. It probably doesn't mean the same thing as yours.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, that's what ours was about, too. But it was more Kentucky distillers saying there's way too much adulteration going on these days, and you have no idea what is coming out in a bottle that has your name on it. And so we got to protect it. But they also got to defer taxes, which was a nice piece of that legislation. But we had that also before that. We had bonded warehouses all the way back to the Civil War. So it just made it easier, I guess, in a way. What's interesting is how long barrels really did remain part of the story. And the Bottled in Bond Act for us was really what started the push towards putting whiskey in bottles. And that's when you start seeing the history of whiskey in bottles in the United States. Up to that point, they were still pretty heavily sending stuff around in barrels and running into those issues of adulteration.
Yeah. Now, the Civil War was the early 1860s, right? So
61 to 65.
That they were selling whiskey in bottles back then.
Yeah, what's interesting
I could be convinced.
Yeah,
you
okay,
guys had glass before we did.
Yeah, so here's the thing. Old Forester says that 1870 they were the first bottled bourbon. Now that's difficult to say, because you can't really. What was bourbon back then? There were no laws for what made bourbon, so it was just a name that was being attached to a corn, spirit. that had other grains in it. But so they say that, but in my research in Tennessee, I'm finding that there was a distiller 2 years earlier that was buying bottles in mass, and bottles were hard to get even then because they still had to be hand blown. There weren't there were semi-automated processes, but there was not an automated process, so they couldn't mass produce these bottles. So they were expensive and difficult to get. But I have newspaper articles in the 1850s talking about bottling of whiskeys. So that so they were bottling it, but it was more, you'd bring your jug and someone would fill your jug with, and you just keep reusing the same jug over and over again when you bought your spirit and took it home. So, but yeah, it evolved slowly over time. That's what's interesting about Ireland. Ireland was really slow in moving from the barrel to the bottle, and that hurt them because adulteration went all the way up through Prohibition, and so it really soured the name of Irish whiskey over time, whereas Scotland decided much earlier to go to putting it in bottles. So
okay, Drew. Final question.
Yeah,
because
I was going to say
my stomach is starting to call me to dinner.
I was going to say we could probably chat on and on and on for hours, but I appreciate you, Davin, taking the time and talking through this and giving people really more of a sense of Canadian whiskey and maybe dispelling a few of those myths that are out there. And I am all about that. So I look forward to further conversations with you about it down the road. But if people want to find your book and find out more information about you, what's the best way for them to seek you out on the web?
Well, I hate to say it, but the best way to find my book, it's called Canadian Whisky, The New Portable Expert. The best way to find that is Amazon. You can find it online in virtually any country around the world. The same with the definitive guide to Canadian distilleries, which I wrote with Blair Phillips, by the way. Find them online. My website is canadianwhiskey.org. I very rarely update it these days.
Okay.
I'm on Instagram, but more reading than writing. You
have enough time to write.
I have less public exposure than I used to.
Very, very nice. All right. Very good. Well, again, thank you so much, and I appreciate you spending the time, and hopefully people will get an inkling to go find that Canadian shelf in their store and do some dabbling around and see what they can find. I appreciate you taking the time, and cheers.
Cheers to you too, Drew. Take care. Now.